I can't pinpoint the exact moment I lost control of my life. Maybe it was the day I got that email about the expedition. A simple subject line that read, "The Call of the Peaks, an adventure awaits." I was scrolling through a dozen promotions I'd never opened when I stopped at that one. Adventure. Mountains. Escape. My life at the time was a shamble of half-finished projects and unopened bills. My girlfriend had left 3 months earlier, citing my inability to connect, whatever that meant. The isolation that followed felt like drowning in quicksand, slow and inexorable. So when the opportunity to join an expedition to a remote mountain range in Central Asia landed in my inbox, I didn't think. I just clicked. Apply. 2 weeks later, I was standing in a room full of strangers, surrounded by maps and charts, the air buzzing with nervous energy. Our destination? The Tauric Ridge, a jagged series of peaks buried deep in the heart of an uncharted wilderness. No one had attempted to map the area for decades. The last known explorers, a Soviet team, had disappeared in 1987. No trace of them was ever found, save for an abandoned camp and a handful of cryptic notes, which local legend claimed contained warnings against venturing further. But I didn't believe in legends. Day 1, the ascent. The air was razor-sharp as we climbed higher, each step feeling like it took an eternity. Snow blanketed everything, muting the sounds of our party's movements. My breath came in short, shallow gasps as the altitude began to take its toll. Our guide, a local named Dima, led the group with a quiet intensity. He barely spoke, but his presence was commanding. The rest of us, a mix of mountaineers, scientists, and a journalist named Katia, followed in his wake. The first night, we made camp on a small plateau. As the fire crackled and the wind howled, Katia regaled us with stories of the ridge's history. "They say the mountains are alive," she whispered, her face illuminated by the firelight. "Not in the way we think of life, but something older, something that watches." The group chuckled nervously, though I noticed Dima's face darken. "Superstitions," he muttered, poking the fire with a stick. "Stories to keep people away." Still, that night, as I lay in my sleeping bag, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The darkness beyond the campfire felt oppressive, as though it were pressing down on us, waiting. Day 3, the Whispering Wind. By the third day, we had climbed well above the tree line. The barren landscape was otherworldly, a sea of jagged rocks and ice that stretched endlessly in every direction. That was when we started hearing the whispers. At first, I thought it was the wind, a trick of the altitude messing with my senses. But as the day wore on, the whispers became distinct. Words, though I couldn't understand them, seemed to drift on the breeze. I wasn't the only one. "Do you hear that?" Katia asked during a brief rest. Her face was pale, her hands trembling as she gripped her thermos. "Hear what?" Dima replied, though his eyes betrayed him. He'd heard it too. "The voices," I said, surprising myself with how calm I sounded. "They're everywhere." Dima didn't respond, but his grip tightened on his walking stick. Day 5, the cave. The snowstorm hit us hard on the 5th day. Visibility dropped to near zero, and the howling wind drowned out all attempts at conversation. Dima led us to the mouth of a cave, where we huddled together for warmth. The cave was deeper than we expected, stretching far into the mountain. Katia and I ventured a short way inside with our headlamps, the others too exhausted to care. The walls of the cave were strange, covered in intricate carvings that didn't resemble anything I'd ever seen. They weren't human, that much was certain. The patterns seemed to twist and writhe under the light, forming shapes that made my stomach churn. "What is this?" Katia whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm outside. I shook my head, unable to answer. But deep down, I felt it, an overwhelming sense of dread, as though we had stumbled into a place we were never meant to find. Day 6. Missing. When we awoke the next morning, one of our party was gone. Yuri, a seasoned climber, had vanished without a trace. His gear was still there, untouched, but there was no sign of him. No footprints leading away from the cave. Nothing. People don't just disappear, Katya said, pacing back and forth. Dima's face was unreadable. We keep moving, he said, his tone brooking no argument. Reluctantly, we packed up and continued the ascent, though every step felt heavier than the last. Day 8. The descent into madness. By the 8th day, the whispers had grown louder, more insistent. They didn't stop when we covered our ears. Katya was the first to break. She collapsed in the snow, clutching her head and screaming about faces in the rocks. They're watching us, she cried, her voice raw with terror. Don't you see them? They're everywhere. Dima tried to calm her, but she pushed him away, scrambling backward until she hit a jagged outcropping. Blood bloomed across the snow as her head struck the rock. She was dead before we could reach her. Day 10. The truth. The whispers weren't whispers anymore. They were voices, clear and deafening, speaking in a language I couldn't understand. We found the Soviet team's camp on the 10th day. The tents were still there, half buried in snow, but the sight that awaited us inside froze me to the core. Bones, arranged in intricate patterns, littered the ground. Symbols carved into the flesh of the deceased stared back at us, mocking. And then we found the journal. The final entry, scrawled in frantic handwriting, read, "The mountain is not a place. It is a thing. It calls to you, and once you answer, it will not let you go. We are its playthings, its sacrifice. Do not listen to the voices. Do not follow the light. Do not." The entry ended abruptly. Day 12. Alone. One by one, the others succumbed. Some wandered off into the blizzard, chasing phantoms only they could see. Others turned on each other, driven mad by the voices. Dima was the last to go. He stood at the edge of a crevasse, staring into the abyss before turning to me. "The mountain has chosen you," he said, his voice calm, almost reverent. "You must finish what we started." Before I could stop him, he stepped off the edge, vanishing into the void. Now I am alone. The whispers are no longer whispers. They scream, relentless and unyielding, promising secrets I can't comprehend. I don't know how much longer I can resist. The mountain calls, and I am afraid I will answer. I didn't take the job for the adventure. I took it because I was desperate. When I got the call from the Whitaker Research Institute, offering a hefty sum to assist their expedition to the Piagnitsa mountain range, I said yes without hesitation. The range was notorious: treacherous terrain, unpredictable weather, and a history of eerie disappearances. The Institute wanted a documentarian, someone to chronicle the journey for research purposes. That's where I came in. I was a nobody, a freelance photographer barely scraping by. My rent was overdue, and my fridge was empty. So when they promised me enough money to cover a year's worth of bills, I didn't ask questions. I should have asked questions. Day 1. We landed in the small outpost of Verkhny Selo, a village at the base of the mountains. It was the kind of place where time seemed to stand still. The locals avoided eye contact, their faces weathered and grim. Our team was small. Dr. Whitaker, the leader of the expedition, and a geologist obsessed with uncovering what she called the secrets of the stones. Her assistant, Marcus, a quiet but competent climber, and Anya, a cartographer who seemed too cheerful for a place like this. The goal was to investigate a series of mysterious formations at the peak of Mount Piagnitsa. Satellite images had shown massive, spiral-shaped indentations in the snow, patterns too deliberate to be natural. The locals called the area Vekny Plash, the Eternal Veil. They warned us not to go, muttering about cursed winds and vengeful spirits. Dr. Whitaker dismissed them as superstitious nonsense. "It's just folklore," she said, her voice clipped with impatience. "We're here for science." Day 3. The first 2 days of climbing were uneventful. The terrain was grueling, but the weather held. I focused on my camera, capturing the stark beauty of the mountains, the jagged cliffs, the icy expanses, the way the light played on the snow. On the 3rd day, the weather turned. A dense fog rolled in, so thick it was like wading through a sea of white. Our visibility dropped to almost nothing, and the air grew unnaturally still. That was when we first heard it, a faint, mournful sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "What the hell is that?" Marcus muttered, squinting into the fog. "Probably the wind," Dr. Whitaker said, though her tone was less confident than usual. But it didn't sound like wind. It sounded like a voice. Day 5. By the 5th day, the fog had become our constant companion. It clung to us like a living thing, muting the world around us. That night, as we set up camp on a narrow ledge, Marcus and I sat by the stove, trying to warm our hands. "Do you ever feel like we're being watched?" he asked, his voice low. I nodded. I'd felt it too, a prickling at the back of my neck, an oppressive weight that seemed to press down on me whenever we stopped moving. "It's the fog," I said, though I didn't believe my own words. "It messes with your head." Marcus didn't reply. Later that night, I woke to the sound of movement outside my tent. I grabbed my camera, unzipping the flap just enough to peer out. The fog was thicker than ever, but I could just make out a figure standing a few feet away. It wasn't Marcus or Dr. Whitaker. The figure was too tall, its proportions all wrong. Its head turned slowly, as if searching for something, and for a moment, I thought it looked directly at me. I ducked back into the tent, my heart pounding. Day 7. We reached the spiral formations on the 7th day. The patterns were massive, carved into the snow with an eerie precision. Standing in the center of one, I felt a strange hum beneath my feet, a vibration that seemed to resonate through my entire body. "This is incredible," Dr. Whitaker breathed, running her gloved hands over a stone pillar protruding from the ground. The pillar was covered in strange symbols, unlike anything I'd ever seen. Anya frowned, her usual cheerfulness gone. "These markings, they don't make sense. They're not natural, but they don't match any known language or culture. Maybe they're pre-human," Dr. Whitaker said, her eyes gleaming with excitement. That night, as we camped near the formations, the fog seemed to thicken into an almost physical barrier. The hum grew louder, and the mournful sound returned, closer this time. Marcus was the first to crack. "We need to leave," he said, pacing back and forth. "This place isn't right. We've seen enough." Dr. Whitaker dismissed him with a wave of her hand. "Don't be ridiculous. We're on the verge of a major discovery." But I agreed with Marcus. Something about the spirals felt wrong, like we were intruding on something ancient and malevolent. Day 8. I woke to screaming. Anya's tent was empty, the flap torn open. We found her footprints in the snow, leading away from the camp and into the spirals. We followed them, calling her name, but the fog swallowed our voices. The footprints ended abruptly in the center of one of the spirals, as if she'd been plucked from the earth. Dr. Whitaker refused to turn back, insisting we continue our work. Marcus and I exchanged uneasy glances, but neither of us argued. That night, I heard whispers in the fog. They weren't coming from outside my tent. They were inside. Day 10. By the 10th day, Marcus was gone. He disappeared during the night, just like Anya. His gear was still in his tent, untouched. Dr. Whitaker was frantic, though she tried to hide it. "We're close," she muttered, more to herself than to me. "I can feel it." I didn't tell her about the voices, or the figure I'd seen again the previous night, this time closer, its face obscured but its presence unmistakably wrong. I thought about leaving, but the fog had become impenetrable. I had no idea how to get down the mountain. Day 12. It's just me now. Dr. Whitaker vanished 2 nights ago. She'd been studying the symbols on one of the stone pillars, mumbling to herself about unlocking the pattern. I woke to find her notes scattered across the snow, her footprints leading toward the summit. I should have gone after her, but I couldn't. Something was holding me back, a primal fear that rooted me in place. Now, I sit alone in the center of the largest spiral, writing this account in the vain hope that someone will find it. The fog is alive. It moves like a predator, circling closer with each passing hour. The hum has become deafening, a constant vibration that drowns out my thoughts. And the voices, they're not whispers anymore. They're inside my head, filling it with images I can't understand, twisted landscapes, endless voids, things that shouldn't exist. I don't know if I'll make it through the night. If you're reading this, turn back. Don't follow the spirals. Don't listen to the voices. And whatever you do, don't look into the fog. The mountain didn't look so ominous at first. Its snow-covered ridges glistened under the pale morning sun, and the sharp peaks scraped at a sky that was deceptively blue. But there was something about it that unsettled me. Maybe it was the stories. Everyone had heard them, of climbers who went missing without a trace, of strange shapes glimpsed in the fog, and of whispers carried on the wind. I didn't believe any of it, not at first. But standing there at the base, staring up at its jagged cliffs, I felt a knot tighten in my chest. The others didn't seem bothered. "There's nothing to worry about," Victor said, adjusting the straps of his pack. His voice carried the casual confidence of someone who'd been up more peaks than he could count. "We're not the first to climb Piraeus, and we won't be the last." Lena, our medic, laughed. "Unless we disappear too." Victor shot her a look, but she only grinned. It was just a joke after all. Except it didn't feel like a joke. Not to me. Our team was small, just 5 of us. Victor, the leader, had recruited me a month earlier when I'd mentioned my interest in documenting extreme climbs. I was there to capture footage for a documentary, not to scale the peak myself. But the more I watched them prepare, the more I felt drawn to join. There was also Lena, whose easy humor masked her sharp instincts. Raoul, our quiet navigator who always seemed to know where to go, and Sophie, our rookie climber with something to prove. Together, we set out to conquer a mountain that had swallowed dozens of expeditions before us. I didn't realize, not then, that it wasn't the mountain we needed to fear. Day 1, the ascent. The first day was easy enough. We followed a trail through dense pine forests, the air crisp and filled with the earthy scent of snow and wood. Birds flitted between the trees, and for a while, it felt more like a hike than an expedition. The mood was light. Victor and Lena joked back and forth. Raoul stayed silent but steady, and Sophie asked a million questions about the mountain. "Why do they call it Piraeus?" she asked during one of our breaks. "It's from an old legend," Victor said, pulling out a map. "Something about a temple at the top, hidden by snow and ice. Supposedly, anyone who finds it never comes back." Sophie raised an eyebrow. "And we're climbing it. Why?" Victor laughed. "Because we're not looking for a temple. We're just here to prove we can do it." I stayed quiet, focusing on my camera as I filmed the group. But even through the lens, something about the forest felt wrong. The trees grew too close together, their branches clawing at the sky like twisted fingers. And the further we went, the quieter it became. By the time we set up camp, the birds had stopped singing. Day 2, into the fog. The fog came early the next morning, rolling in thick and fast. It swallowed the trees and muffled our voices, reducing the world to a ghostly white blur. "This isn't normal," Raoul muttered, staring into the mist. "It's just weather," Victor said, though his tone was less confident than usual. "It'll pass." But it didn't pass. By midday, the fog was so dense we could barely see a few feet ahead. The trail disappeared, leaving us to rely on Raoul's compass and Victor's instincts. That was when we heard the first sound. A faint rustling, like something moving through the trees. "Probably just the wind," Lena said, though she gripped her ice axe a little tighter. I wanted to believe her, but it didn't sound like the wind. It sounded like footsteps. Day 3, the first loss. By the third day, the fog had become our constant companion. The trail was gone, and the air was so thick with moisture that our gear was perpetually damp. We were setting up camp when Sophie screamed. We all turned, but she was gone. Her pack and gear were still there, neatly piled by the fire pit. There were no footprints leading away, no sign of a struggle. She had simply vanished. Victor tried to keep us calm, insisting she must have wandered off, but I could see the fear in his eyes. We searched for hours, calling her name into the fog, but there was no response. That night, none of us slept. The morning after Sophie disappeared, none of us spoke as we packed up camp. The silence felt wrong, like the mountain itself was pressing down on us, squeezing the words from our throats. Victor took the lead, his movements mechanical as he checked our gear and adjusted his pack. "We keep moving," he said finally. "If Sophie's out there, we'll find her further up. If not—" He didn't finish the sentence. Lena shot him a glare. "We're not just leaving her behind. We're not," he snapped, though his voice cracked under the weight of his own doubt. "But if we stay here, we're all going to get hypothermia. We move and we keep an eye out." Raoul nodded silently, his face ashen. We trudged forward, our footsteps muffled by the snow and fog. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every so often, I'd glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see Sophie's face staring back at me through the mist. Instead, I saw something worse. At first, it was just a shadow, a flicker of movement in the corner of my eye. But as the hours passed, the shapes became more distinct. They darted between the trees, always staying just out of focus. "Did you see that?" I whispered to Lena, walking beside me. She frowned. "See what?" I hesitated. "Nothing. Probably nothing." But it wasn't nothing. That night, Raoul disappeared. One moment, he was there, sitting by the fire with his hands wrapped around a steaming cup of tea. The next, he was gone. His boots, his pack, even the cup of tea were still there, untouched. It was as if he'd been erased from existence. Victor's composure cracked. He paced around the camp, shouting Raoul's name into the fog until his voice was hoarse. Lena pulled me aside, her usually calm demeanor replaced with barely contained panic. "We have to leave," she whispered. "Now! We don't even know which way is down," I said, my voice shaking. "Then we figure it out," she said, gripping my arm. "Whatever's happening here, it's not natural. We're not equipped for this." I wanted to agree, but Victor wasn't listening. He was already packing his gear, muttering to himself about reaching the summit. "This mountain doesn't get to beat us," he said, his voice trembling. "We keep moving. We finish what we started." I glanced at Lena, hoping she'd argue, but she just shook her head. "He's lost it," she murmured. The summit was closer now, though it felt like a mirage, always within reach but never any nearer. The carvings appeared shortly after we broke camp. At first, they were faint scratches on the boulders we passed, like claw marks etched into the stone. But as we climbed higher, they became more elaborate, spirals, geometric patterns, and strange symbols that seemed to hum faintly when I looked at them too long. Victor stopped to examine one of the larger carvings, his eyes wide with a mix of awe and fear. "This is it," he said, tracing a gloved finger along the grooves. "Proof that there was something here." Lena snorted. "Something? You mean someone?" Victor shook his head. "No, this isn't human." I wanted to argue, but a low sound cut me off. It was the same rustling I'd heard before, but louder now, closer. We froze, straining our ears. "Maybe it's Raoul," Victor said, though his voice lacked conviction. It wasn't Raoul. The shadow emerged from the fog like a specter, impossibly tall and thin, its limbs too long and its movements jerky, like a marionette controlled by an unskilled puppeteer. Its face, or what should have been its face, was smooth and featureless, a blank expanse that made my stomach churn. Victor stepped back, his foot slipping on the icy ground. "What the hell is that?" Lena grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "Run!" We didn't need to be told twice. We ran until our lungs burned, the world a blur of snow and fog. I didn't look back, afraid of what I might see. When we finally stopped, gasping for breath, Lena turned to Victor, her eyes blazing with anger. "This is your fault. You brought us here." Victor didn't respond. He just stared at the ground, his hands trembling. I wanted to say something, to tell them to stop fighting, but the sound returned, closer this time. The rustling turned to whispers, soft and indistinct, like 1,000 voices speaking at once. "Do you hear that?" Lena whispered, her voice barely audible. I nodded, my throat too dry to speak. Victor stood, his eyes glazed. "It's calling us." "What are you talking about?" Lena snapped. "The summit," he said, his voice distant. "It's where we're meant to go." Lena grabbed his arm, shaking him. "Snap out of it, Victor. We need to get off this mountain." But he pulled away, his gaze fixed on the peak above us. "We're so close. I can't stop now." Without another word, he started climbing. I should have stopped him. Instead, I followed, too terrified to stay behind. Lena cursed under her breath, but eventually fell in line, her grip on her ice axe tight enough to turn her knuckles white. The summit loomed closer, the carvings growing more frequent and more elaborate. The symbols seemed to glow faintly, pulsating in time with the whispers that now filled the air. When we finally reached the top, I felt no sense of relief. The summit wasn't what I expected. It was a plateau, flat and barren, with a single stone monolith standing at its center. The monolith was covered in the same strange carvings, but these were deeper, more intricate, as if they'd been etched by something with infinite patience. Victor approached the monolith, his movements slow and reverent. "Don't," Lena said, her voice trembling. He didn't listen. As his hand touched the stone, the whispers stopped. The silence was deafening, pressing down on us like a physical weight. And then the fog parted. What I saw will haunt me for the rest of my life. The world beyond the summit wasn't the world we've left behind. The sky was black, speckled with stars that pulsed like dying embers. The ground stretched out in all directions, an endless expanse of jagged rock and ice. Shapes moved in the distance, tall, thin figures like the one we'd seen before, their movements jerky and unnatural. Victor stood frozen, his hand still pressed against the monolith. His eyes were wide, his mouth open in a silent scream. Lena grabbed my arm, pulling me back. "We have to go," she said, her voice barely audible. But it was too late. The figures turned toward us, their blank faces tilting as if noticing us for the first time. Victor let out a strangled cry as the monolith began to glow, its carvings pulsing with an otherworldly light. The ground beneath us shifted, the snow and ice cracking like glass. Lena pulled harder, dragging me away from the monolith as the first figure stepped onto the summit. "Run!" she screamed. I don't remember how we got off the mountain. The next thing I knew, I was stumbling through the forest at its base, my camera and gear gone, my hands raw and bloody. Lena was nowhere to be found. The locals found me the next day, delirious and half-frozen. They didn't ask questions, their faces grim as they led me back to the village. I tried to tell them what happened, but they just shook their heads. "You're lucky to be alive," one of them said. Am I? Sometimes, I still hear the whispers, soft and distant, like a memory I can't escape. And when I close my eyes, I see the summit. I see the monolith. And I know it's waiting for me.